All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started just because there's that little bit of a lag period. So I think folks might not hear our questions for a little bit until after we ask them.
Okay.
I'm Chelsea Romulo, and I'm an assistant professor at University of Northern Colorado. And I'm very excited to introduce Erin Youngberg, community and outreach biologist with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. The Bird Conservancy's mission is conserving birds and their habitats through science, education, and land stewardship. And so I think that really connects well with our Society of Conservation Biology. So Erin's going to take us on a bit of a tour of the Soapstone Prairie Natural Area to talk about collaborative conservation. Erin, I'll let you take control of the video and the audio and the PowerPoint, and I'm going to turn off my video and audio, but I will be monitoring the Q&A. So folks that are viewing this session, please feel free to post questions and things like that, and we'll get to them as Erin is going through her presentation. I'll also be posting links to resources and things as Erin is talking about them, and I'll start with the Twitter handle for Bird Conservancy. So if you want to follow them, they've been doing some really great webinars and virtual engagement while we're all trying to deal with this pandemic and staying safe at home. Erin, thank you for being here today. I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Chelsea. And thanks everybody for joining us today and coming on our virtual field trip. Can you see that title screen okay? And I hope your conference has been going great so far. I'm excited to take you to the mountains to plains area of northern Colorado, and that is where Soapstone Prairie is, as well as a couple of other properties in northern Colorado. And taking you there today from the comfort of your chair, your couch, or your exercise ball, wherever you are. First, I would like to introduce you to the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies a little bit. Chelsea did mention our mission to conserve birds and their habitats. We are a nonprofit based in the Front Range of Colorado, and I'm in the Fort Collins office. Our work, though, radiates throughout the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains, from Canada across 14 different western and central states and down actually into northern Mexico. We use an integrated approach of science, where we are conducting research and monitoring on our bird populations, our shared bird populations, and to advance knowledge. We have stewardship, where we're working to deliver conservation on the ground with landowners where habitat exists on private lands for birds. We also have an education and outreach team to inspire our next generation of land and wildlife stewards. And we have in-class and outdoor learning experiences, and you can learn more about where we work and what we are up to at our website, and that's www.birdconservancy.org. So on our virtual field trip today, I'm going to take you to a place that is near and dear to my heart here in northern Colorado. First, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself, and then some background and context about why this place is so special. And I'd like to introduce you to the Mountains to Plains project and itself, get to know the area and its wildlife beyond birds. There's also all kinds of fun and exciting research projects that are happening up there. We've made some fun and interesting discoveries, and then I want to share about our newest project that we just started last month that's creating a MODIS network in the northern Great Plains. And then I'm happy to take any questions you all might have, not only at the end, but feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll see if we can answer them as well as we go. So first, a little bit about me. I grew up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, surrounded by the beauty of the outdoors in a really outdoor avid family. Actually, both of my parents were hunting guides, and my dad was a taxidermist. So I was surrounded with all things wildlife and nature, hiking and fishing and camping. I knew I wanted to have a career in natural resources, a job that would take me outside. But what really changed my life was a trip with my 7th grade class as a 12-year-old. We all went up to a banding station in Teton National Park, and the bird biologist there was handling the bird she'd gotten out of the net and putting the band on it and measuring it and explaining to us about migration, and then asked the group of kids if anybody wanted to let the bird go. And my hand shot up. I said, "Ooh, me, I do." And she put the bird in my hand, much like that picture shows. That's actually one of our bird banders there. And the bird flew off, and I thought to myself, this is her job? I want this job, holy crap. So I went to the University of Wyoming to start my degree in wildlife biology, and then ended up transferring to Colorado State University here in Fort Collins, where I then graduated in 2009 and got my first summer temporary job as an avian technician for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And they were doing a bird nest survival study up at Soapstone Prairie. So the birds that nest in the grasslands build their nest in a cup on the ground. And in order to find their nests, you do what's called rope dragging, which is what that top picture is showing, me and my colleague, with a 50-meter rope that you actually drag across to create a disturbance and flush the mother bird off of her nest. So once we found a nest, if it had eggs in it, we would float those eggs like I'm doing in that top right photo to determine the age of the nest. And then if there's fledglings, determine the age of hatch. And we'd come back every other day to see whether that nest fledged or failed. So my first summer was spent in this landscape, looking at baby birds. Needless to say, I was hooked, and in my 11th year now, working for Bird Conservancy in the Mountains Plains area. Bird Conservancy has several ongoing projects that study grassland birds, actually, and there was a publication that came out this past year in the Journal of Science that Bird Conservancy biologists were co-authors in, that shows that we have lost 3 billion of our birds total in the last 50 years. Grassland birds have been the largest group of birds affected by far. In fact, several species have lost between 50 to 90% of their global populations. Several grassland birds are therefore on federal and state lists for species of conservation concern. And several of these grassland birds of concern can actually be found right here in this area of northern Colorado that I will be talking about today. I'm going to show you a couple of maps that just talk about the distribution of our grassland birds. This first map is highlighting the distribution of our breeding grassland birds. The red line that you can see is outlining the North America's grasslands, and then the densities of breeding birds therein. And you can see eastern Colorado is included, and it contains some of the highest density of breeding grassland birds, which make this area a pretty important piece of the larger puzzle for grassland bird habitat conservation. And then in the winter, a vast majority of these birds migrate south into the Chihuahuan Desert. That's southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico. And there they concentrate in very limited grasslands in that region. And in fact, the Chihuahuan Desert supports fully 90% of all these species for about 2/3 of their year, sometimes more. So there's this tremendous concentration effect that happens in the wintertime. And the grasslands here in Northeast Colorado aid in birds' connectivity from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds in Mexico. And actually, Bird Conservancy has also been conducting annual winter survival studies in northern Mexico for the past 7 years. So having data from both the breeding and the wintering grounds for grassland birds is giving us a better picture on their life cycle needs, and we're trying to learn exactly where the bottlenecks are for conservation and why our bird populations continue to decline, especially with these grassland species. We do know some of the biggest factors for grassland bird decline is habitat loss and fragmentation. Largest reasons for grassland habitat loss are agricultural expansion, urbanization, and the habitat fragmentation that happens through our natural resource extraction, our building of roads and fences and power lines. Grassland areas are nice and flat, and they appear to be ideal places for these kinds of human activity. But unfortunately, all of those things negatively affect the quality of habitat and reduce those patches of remaining native grassland habitat that these birds need to breed and complete their life cycle. So speaking of open space, that brings us to this particular area of northern Colorado and Larimer County specifically. In 2002, the citizens of Larimer County, Colorado initiated a city and county-wide sales tax of 0.25% to fund the Fort Collins Natural Area Department activities, which included purchasing land for conservation and conservation easements, open space, creating wildlife habitat, trails, and educational programs. So it's all paid for by the taxes of the citizens of Larimer County. So that citizen-led initiative helped the city of Fort Collins purchase the first 18,000 acres, which was Soapstone Prairie, north of Fort Collins, right on the Wyoming border. And that was in the summer of 2004. The city, state, and Larimer County then partnered to purchase properties adjacent and conservation easements all surrounding Soapstone that equal about 60,000 acres, which is that orange polygon that you see on the map there. That's the total area that's just for conservation. And it literally connects the mountains to the west to the plains in the east. And that's all called the Mountains to Plains Project, or sometimes we call it the MTP. So Soapstone Prairie, Red Mountain Open Space, and Meadow Springs Ranch are the three largest pieces of properties that I'll be talking about. These properties contain some of the last remaining high-quality shortgrass prairie and shrubland habitat in the Colorado Front Range. They're also an important priority conservation area within the shortgrass prairie bird conservation region, or what we call BCR 18. And that is outlined in the map there on the bottom right. The tan polygon is BCR 18, and then there's a little orange blob there that shows you where the Mountains to Plains area sits on the western edge of that. So those are the three properties that we call the Mountains to Plains. So in order to help the city manage these properties, we've been conducting annual point counts across all of the properties starting in 2006. And these points are all 250 meters apart, and they cover the entire area in a grid, as you can see. We don't do all of these points each year, but we have definitely surveyed each one at least twice. Rather, our surveys each year are concentrated in areas that are more of management interest to the city. So in this picture, the highlighted habitat of interest is the prairie dog colony habitat, which is the darker orange color. But we've also surveyed post-burn areas to see how bird response is, and we've also surveyed specific habitat for updated inventory. So we've surveyed their salt bush habitat or their mountain mahogany habitat in different years. At each one of these points, we do a 6-minute bird point count, and then we also do a rapid 5-meter diameter % ground cover estimate. So we try to determine how much is forb versus grass versus bare ground, and that way we can measure changes in vegetation at each point across the properties over time. So now talking specifically about soapstone, in the past 13 years of monitoring, we have detected 149 bird species that use the mountains to plains area either for migration or for breeding between 2006 and 2019. Soapstone itself has a wide diversity of habitats and therefore a really wide variety of bird species. So I want to take you on a quick tour with some pretty bird pictures and show you what you can expect to see if you ever get a chance to go up there. Starting in the northwest corner of the property, where it's dominated with mountain mahogany and skunk bush sumac, you're going to find a lot of black-headed grosbeaks, lots and lots of spotted towhees. We have brewer sparrows there, which prefer a shrubby component. Green-tailed towhees, brown thrashers breed up there. The Virginia's warbler, which is actually a Colorado species of concern. Last year, we had our first ever dusky grouse up there, which is cool because usually those are very high elevation species. And then an important grassland predator, the loggerhead shrike, breeds in this area. Moving down to the southwest corner of the property, there's a really ancient and isolated stand of Ponderosa pine. And there we'll find more of our forest bird species that we would expect, like western tanager. Last year we had our first ever Clark's nutcracker. Mourning doves like to roost in the trees there. We'll have chipping sparrows breeding there, violet green swallows flying overhead, western wood pewees calling, lots of American goldfinch breeding, red-tailed hawks, and our black-billed magpies. So that's a really neat suite of species happening there. More in the cliffy areas in the western central part of the property, we find cliff swallows naturally. The cliff nesting golden eagle, we have several pairs nesting up there at Soapstone. Another cliff nesting species, the Prairie Falcon. Lots and lots of rock wrens and brewer's blackbirds. We have several Woodhouse's scrub jays in the area last year too. Lots of common ravens, as they like to nest on the cliffy areas. And last year I heard my first common porwheel about an hour before I took this picture, actually, so that was exciting. And then as we move a little further east, more away from the mountains into the grasslands, with these gentle rolling hills and some washes, we'll find our blue-gray gnatcatchers, our lark sparrows, vesper sparrows, which prefer grasslands with a little bit of shrubby component. We have some blue grosbeaks breeding up there, beautiful bird. Northern rough-winged swallows will breed in the steep cut banks, right in the dirt, little caves. Got broad-tailed hummingbirds up there, and lots of western meadowlarks. They're ubiquitous across the prairie, across the whole property, but definitely increase in numbers as we move east. There are a few areas on the property that have seeps and springs naturally, that we get standing water, running water, and then some plains cottonwoods and narrowleaf cottonwoods pop up, and a little more vegetation. And there we'll find birds like the Bullock's oriole, western kingbirds, yellow warblers, some killdeer in the standing water areas, as well as red-winged blackbirds, northern mockingbirds, and in a few of those available trees we'll get Swainson's hawk. So moving all the way to the eastern part of Soapstone, where the grassland is, there's several species of concern that breed there, and they're considered high priority species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Colorado State, and our partners in flight. They all have lists for these birds due to the significant population declines I mentioned earlier. So then we'll get birds out here like the Mountain Plover, McCown's Longspur, ferruginous hawk, burrowing owl, Grasshopper Sparrow, our Colorado state bird, the Lark Bunting, and more recently, the Baird Sparrow. I mentioned prairie dog colonies as a habitat of interest earlier. Within the mountains to plains properties, there's a complex of several black-tailed prairie dog colonies. And black-tailed prairie dogs are a known keystone species that help maintain a healthy shortgrass prairie ecosystem. The bare ground that they create actually by grazing all the vegetation really short is preferred breeding habitat for birds like the mountain plover and the burrowing owl, which actually relies on the burrows themselves that the prairie dogs dig, because the owls don't dig their own burrows. The McCown's Longspur prefers prairie dog colony habitat, as well as the prairie dogs themselves being an important prey species, prey item for birds like the golden eagle and the ferruginous hawk, and other animals besides birds. We've got swift fox, rattlesnakes, and actually black-footed ferrets that occur up in the mountains to plains area. There's a lot of studies out there regarding how black-tailed prairie dogs and their importance in maintaining that ecosystem health. Well, in 2008, the prairie dog colonies in the mountains to plains area suffered an episode of the Sylvatic Plague. And that reduced their populations by over 70%. So you can see in the map on the left that the year before the plague was detected, they measured over 4,000 acres of active prairie dog colony habitat in the mountains to plains area. And then 1 year after the plague event, in 2009, they measured 571 acres of prairie dog colony habitat, meaning it was an overall reduction of 87% of that very special habitat. The Sylvatic Plague was first introduced to North America in the early 1900s from a port in California, I believe it's San Francisco, by fleas that came on a ship, and it has slowly spread east. It was detected in Colorado around 1948, and it actually continues to cycle at really low levels in prairie dog colonies all around the state. And it has a really high mortality rate in that it kills about 98% of a prairie dog colony once it is introduced. And then with the absence of the prairie dogs grazing that vegetation, you can see clearly this change in habitat and vegetation structure, which then affects the bird species that relied on that habitat and the bare ground for nesting habitat. So there's been a great effort and partnership in the mountains to plains area with the city and Colorado Parks and Wildlife to both dust for fleas and use an oral vaccine. In the picture on the bottom left there, a technician is using an insecticidal dust to spray inside of each burrow to try and eliminate the fleas that carry this plague. And then in the bottom right, the USGS has actually produced an oral vaccine. It looks like a little starburst that he's holding there. It's actually mostly peanut butter, and then they dyed it red so the prairie dogs would eat it. And they actually, the uptake is really good. And with both dusting and vaccinating, we've been really successful in keeping plague out of several colonies in the mountains to plains area. It's just expensive and time consuming, but with these prairie dogs on the landscape, managing for them is really important to preserve them, not only for the birds, but because there's also been a large effort to reintroduce the black-footed ferrets. As their primary food source, it's really important to keep these animals on the landscape. And so here I'd like to share a video of the black-footed ferret reintroduction that happened up at Soapstone that I was lucky to attend back in 2014. I am so... Uh-oh. Sorry. I am so pleased to be here today in this very, very special place to celebrate what is truly an extraordinary reintroduction effort, welcoming home the black-footed ferret to Soapstone Prairie.
In the 70s, we thought that the black-footed ferret was extinct, a lost species. But a small population was found, and through captive breeding and species recovery program, the ferret population is being reintroduced to its natural.
Back in 2003, several local open space advocates, I would say principally Kelly Olson and Linda Stanley and a bunch of other folks, we put an issue on the ballot that helped to raise the funds that ultimately went to purchase Soapstone Natural Area.
Now I know that all of you know that the key to wildlife conservation is habitat, a place like Soapstone Prairie. First, we had to have this large, relatively pristine tract of shortgrass prairie with enough prairie dogs to support a ferret population.
Black-footed ferrets depend almost solely on prairie dogs, and prairie dogs weren't looked upon very favorably when we settled this country. We farmed up a good bit of the country, which disturbed the prairie dog burrows, and they couldn't exist there any longer. And then we poisoned a lot of prairie dogs to stop the competition with domestic livestock. And then a foreign disease came into this country, Sylvatic Plague, which neither ferrets or prairie dogs had any immunity to. So where we're going to put ferrets out, we're going to have to address disease management, but also find a way to work with livestock operators where there are enough prairie dogs there for the ferrets, but not so many that there's a problem.
And the fact that the city and its livestock grazing partners like the Soapstone Grazing Association have come together to help restore what was once the most endangered mammal in North America.
I want to thank all of our leadership at the City of Fort Collins, especially the Natural Resource Department, and our federal and state partners. Representative Fisher was responsible for co-sponsoring the bill this year that allows local entities to reintroduce endangered species to locally owned properties. Oh, are you ready? Yeah.
Let's go.
I think he went down a hole unless he likes the game. He loved went down now.
Now, sometimes people say things never change. I don't believe that's true, and I think that's what we're seeing here today. This place, Soapstone Ranch, will be different because black-footed ferrets will now call Soapstone Prairie home.
Yay! I actually have yet to see one out in the field. I think I'd have to be there in the dark. But someday I hope to go spotlighting with the city and see my first black-footed ferret in the wild. But for several years there, after that plague outbreak in 2008, we focused our bird monitoring effort then on active black-tailed prairie dog colony habitat in the mountains to plains area. Our goal with that was to monitor the impact of that habitat loss due to plague on the shortgrass prairie birds that prefer that habitat. So I want to show you some very basic population trends of some of these birds of concern. The first two being species directly tied to the prairie dog presence and activity. The burrowing owl populations there have fluctuated over the years, but remained relatively stable, even showing a slightly increasing trend. We see peaks in burrowing owl density in years that are following those cyclical plague episodes. It has come through the area now about 3 times since 2008. And we hypothesize that those little peaks are the owls maybe responding to availability now of empty burrows. But we also are learning more about how many years they persist after a plague event. We can see there's been a large decrease in the last few years, but it's also important that we look at regional data to determine what might be going on with burrowing owl populations of the West. But this information tells us at least what's happening on these properties. And so then our management recommendation is to maintain burrowing owl population in this area by continuing to increase opportunities for burrows and encourage the growth of the prairie dog colonies if they can. When we look at where we're detecting individual owls, the owls have been recorded on almost all of our prairie dog colony complexes, both the large colonies and the small ones. And interestingly, in the larger colonies, we see they have a tendency to be towards the edges rather than in the center of the colonies. And I want to point out that the prairie dog layer that we're seeing, that lighter orange color, is from 2007. So between then and now, there has been some contractions and expansions of colony habitat. So where we see owl detections that look like there's no colony, like out to the east, there were colonies in earlier years out there. And actually the dot that's to the farthest east, there's a big colony developing there the last 5 years. So we've had even more bird detections out there. So it's kind of cool to see that they'll use large and small colonies. The mountains to plains area hosted a small but viable population of mountain plover at one point, and we had estimated a population of 50 to 70 individuals, but in recent years we've only seen 1 or 2 during our surveys, and we think it's most likely a direct response to the loss of that prairie dog colony habitat. So we're hopeful that continued management of that habitat will encourage some of those plovers to recolonize. The bump that we see in 2012 was actually a direct response to a burn that the city did on a colony that had plagued out. And the plovers returned that year and they successfully bred and raised young. But without complete recovery of the prairie dogs in that pasture, the plover density again dropped off. And actually there was just 1 confirmed nestling last year on Soapstone. This picture isn't that actual bird, but that was from a few years ago, but still just as cute. So we noticed something interesting about how plovers use the colony habitat, and in total opposite use from what we observed with the owls. Here's a map of the points where we detected plovers from 2006 to 2019, and you can see almost all of the detections have been on the 3 largest prairie dog colony complexes. And each one of those were over 600 acres in size. Remember that this is showing us the 2007 prairie dog layer. So the colony at the very bottom right on the south side of the properties is actually surrounding that little white squares, the Black-footed Ferret breeding center. So they've been dusting and vaccinating that colony every year for the last 10 years. And that colony's actually grown quite a bit since 2007. But this tells us that the plovers tend to prefer larger prairie dog colonies, and therefore we can say that that's a conservation target for the city to maintain prairie dog colonies of at least 600 acres. Another bird of conservation concern breeding in the mountains to plains area is the McCown's Longspur. And northeast Colorado is the only place in Colorado where these birds breed. You'll find some here in the mountains to plains and also a little further east in the Forest Service property, the Pawnee National Grasslands. But we've seen longspur densities decline steadily on these properties by about 50% since our surveys began in 2006. These birds were detected anywhere the ground was relatively flat and the grass was relatively short. So you can see that they're found both on and off prairie dog colonies. McCown's longspurs do tend to be in higher densities inside of colonies, but as you can see, also found off colonies. McCown's longspurs have also had declines in the region, in the whole BCR region. So McCown's longspurs, they've been declining on these properties but they've also been declining regionally. So we think that the declines we see in mountains to plains might not be related to the plague outbreak at all, but maybe something else is going on with their populations. So more research definitely needs to be done on migration and wintering habitat needs. But the most surprising change in avifauna that in this area over the last 13 years that we've seen is the recent appearance of the Baird sparrow. They came out of nowhere in 2015, and they've been persisting here ever since. These birds prefer vast, undisturbed areas of native tallgrass prairie. And in places where we once had the mountain plover and the grass has grown in now, we're finding this tallgrass obligate species, which is also a national bird of concern. This is really significant because all of the other historical breeding records for these birds are in North Dakota, northern Montana, and Canada. Rarely have they been detected in Wyoming or Colorado, except for the last few years. And you can see how Soapstone and the Mountains to Plains area is almost right in the middle of their breeding and wintering grounds. So what are they doing here is what we said when we first detected them. This can't be possible. So then in 2018, we decided to go and capture and band as many singing males as we could to learn more about this potential new population. After persisting for 3 years in a row, we thought they might be breeding here, or we wanted to know if they were the same individuals returning here. So we'd go out at dawn and set up mist net arrays. Catching grassland birds in a mist net is very different from catching any other birds at a traditional banding station. We set them up in a T-shape array, and then in the middle of each bird's territory. And then we use a playback device. So that's what that picture is in the top right. It's a Fox Pro that is uploaded with the Bird Sparrow song. Let's see if this will play for you. I can play it. So we use that playback of the male Baird sparrow song. And it's successful in luring the males into the net because they think it's an intruder. So they'll fly aggressively right towards that sound and get caught in our net. And we were able to catch 10 male Baird sparrows, and then on those 10, we color banded them with a USGS band on the right leg, and then that orange color band you see on his left leg. We also deployed a light level geolocator. It's a data logger, and you can see it sticking out of the middle of his back there. That little kind of frosty bulb looking thing is the light data logger. So it determines latitude and longitude based on where the bird is and where solar noon is. So we thought that since these birds had been returning for 3 consecutive years, perhaps some of them were returning individuals, the same ones, and at least one of these 10 that we caught would come back. This guy will wear this geolocator all the way down to Mexico and then all the way back. And the trick with geolocators is that you have to recapture that same bird to remove that device and download the data. It does not emit data in real time. The GIS tracking software is not small enough yet to fit on a small songbird like a Baird sparrow. So fingers crossed that some of these birds would come back. Unfortunately, we didn't have any return to the properties, not yet, but they're still out there. If anybody ever sees one with an orange leg band, our partners can let us know and we'll go out and catch him. So with no returning birds in 2019, last year, but we had a whole new group of singing males. We decided to capture and color band 11 of those in the Mountains to Plains area. And instead of the geolocators, we then used unique color band combinations. So there's a color band on each leg in a unique combination. And in that way, it's easier to resight the bird with a camera or a scope and identify that bird without needing to recapture it to determine, are the same birds returning? How are they using the habitat? So we could even monitor them throughout the breeding season. Are these birds breeding up here? And what else can we learn about their movements? And this spring in 2020, we did in fact see a bird that we color banded last year return to the same pasture where he was banded. So that was our first indication that at least some of these birds are in fact returning to Soapstone. So that was super exciting.
Hey, Erin, we don't have your share screen. I didn't.
Uh-oh.
That's okay.
Let's see.
I think playing the bird song made it go.
Oh, really? Okay. Hang on. Let me try that again then. That was a great bird song though, wasn't it? Thanks
Came
for
through
letting me know.
great.
So can you see that? Mr. Bird Sparrow?
No, are you sharing it on the Zoom?
Let me try it. Oh, let me look. Share screen. Oh, sorry. There we go.
We got you now.
Did you see the map earlier?
Yeah, it was sharing earlier, so I'm not sure how we lost that, but we're good to go now.
Super duper. Hang on, actually. No, that's good. Okay. So there's the male Baird sparrow. There we go. And there's the color banded birds. So we got double black, double yellow, and there was one even banded with a red and green that we called Christmas. The bird with the two yellow bands, actually, that circled at the top right, was one of the birds that actually did end up breeding there that summer, last summer. So that was cool. And here, I was about to share a video. This is my daughter, Ramona, releasing a Baird sparrow at Meadow Springs last year.
Close your fingers. Just like that. The rest of your hand goes around him. I got a smile for your mom too.
Nice job. Nice job.
Just set him down on your other hand and aim it that way.
You can hear some birds sing in the background too.
Go. Bye, buddy.
And there he goes. So we did that with all 11 birds. Ramona was just there to help us with the one day. So in addition to our banding efforts, we also conducted focused searches in both 2018 when we did the geolocator birds and in 2019 when we just did the color banded birds. We had volunteers and some of our staff go up to do rope dragging, nest searching, and watch these birds until one of our technicians found a fledgling being fed by an adult Baird sparrow up in Soapstone, which confirmed that they were in fact breeding. And it was the first state record that year in 2018. Then we found a fledgling in a different pasture in 2019, and that was from a nest of one of our banded birds, that double yellow banded bird. We also found an actual Baird sparrow nest with the fledgling still in it, which is notoriously difficult to find. And so that was actually the first physical nest state record. So after spending lots of hot, rainy, windy, and buggy hours watching these elusive birds, we were finally rewarded with this evidence of what we had suspected for the previous 4 years, that these birds are returning and they are in fact breeding in the mountains to plains area. So then we took that data and last year published a manuscript in the journal Ecology in the Scientific Naturalist series about this discovery as evidence of potential range expansion for the Baird sparrow, which is super exciting. So in addition to our work on Soapstone, Bird Conservancy has several study sites in northern Montana and North Dakota in the Great Plains where we're studying adult and fledgling survival success for both the Baird sparrow and the grasshopper sparrows. We've also been working, as I said, with these species in the wintering grounds of northern Mexico on their overwinter survival. So how many of them actually survive the winter to come back up to breed every year. These two species are an indicator species of healthy grassland habitat. So if they're present, the habitat's usually very high quality, and conservation efforts that are targeted for grasshopper and Baird sparrows then benefit a whole suite of other grassland obligate species like Sprague's pipits, chestnut-colored longspurs, and lots of other grassland birds of concern. This map on the left shows where their ranges, their breeding ranges overlap, and their wintering areas overlap, and where we have study sites in those areas. So the red rectangles are our study sites in the breeding areas. Those black circles are where we have study sites for our winter survival areas. And then those green stars are actually where we have wildlife biologists that work on the ground with ranchers and land managers in that area to do habitat conservation, grassland conservation on the ground in the northern Great Plains. This effort that's across borders and grassland bird ranges was the first of its kind to collect data in both breeding and wintering grounds, and then therefore capturing the full annual life cycle conservation for these birds. And with this new discovery in Colorado, it ties in really well with helping us understand their full life cycle needs. But in order to really better understand movements and habitat use of grassland birds during migration, as well as their breeding and winter movements, and then as technology is improved, there's new ways to get this information, and we're really excited to start a new project in the grasslands using the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System, or what we just call MODIS, which is a collaboration of researchers that maintain a network of receiving stations across the Americas, which are what those blue dots are indicating. It's a program out of Bird Studies Canada, and they partner with over 75 researchers and organizations. And MODIS facilitates landscape scale research and education on ecology and conservation of migratory flying animals. So it's not just for birds. They put them on monarchs and dragonflies and bats. And it's awesome, actually, to see it working. You can see that the MODIS network is really well developed in the East Coast especially, but not so much in the West. So Bird Conservancy is currently developing and implementing a coordinated partner network for MODIS station locations throughout the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion, which is what's outlined in green there, to track grassland bird habitat use and their movements across the landscape. And it will be the first of its kind for grassland bird research. Soapstone Prairie Natural Area is really well situated at the western edge of the Great Plains, right there in northern Colorado for one of the stations. So any bird that's been radio tagged can be detected up to 20 miles away from any MODIS station. So there's partners we're working with that are tagging Swainson's thrushes up in Canada and Montana, and those birds do pass through Soapstone Prairie on their way to South America. So we'll be able to detect those birds this year on their migration. So we're really excited to see what that station will detect. All the data that's collected from these stations are fed into a master database at Bird Studies Canada's National Data Center, and it's archived there and it's distributed to researchers and the general public. It's all open source data. So you can check out modis.org and zoom in on any one station and see its detections in real time. So we installed the first MODIS station of our Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert Network last month up at Soapstone in June on one of the field houses up there. So the antennas that you see are oriented in all four cardinal directions to receive the radio signals that the tags emit from the birds deployed in the field. which means we got to catch more birds this summer. Here's our mobile banding station. We've got the sport umbrella that blocks the sun and the wind, and that box there, the pink foam, is our tags, our modus tags for the birds. And then that bird below is our handsome Lark Bunting, male Lark Bunting, before he got his tag. We had 4 species of interest that we were targeting, the Lark Bunting, Grasshopper Sparrow, and Baird Sparrow for their, because they're indicator species of healthy grassland habitat, as well as the McCown's Longspur, more shortgrass obligate species. But full disclosure, we did not have any success in capturing McCown's Longspur this year. They're really extremely difficult to catch because they do an elaborate air display and float down, kind of straight down on their wings. They don't fly towards our net. So if anybody has any pointers on how to catch McCown's Longspurs, I am all ears. The tags are mounted on our birds with white beading elastic, so it's coated so it won't chafe the birds, and it's nice and stretchy so they can still move. And we put it as a figure 8 leg loop harness, it's called. So we put a leg through each loop, and then the tag sits on the back of the birds like a little backpack. And then we fit the tag to each bird and cut off the excess elastic. So that's our Grasshopper Sparrow on the left and our male Lark Bunting on the right. I believe that's actually a different male Lark Bunting. We tagged 3 this year. And then you can see on the left here, the Grasshopper Sparrow has a tag, the modus tag has a tiny solar panel. So that's what keeps the tag emitting a frequency. And if it flies within 20 miles of any modus station, it will be detected as it moves south towards Mexico. And then our Baird Sparrow friend on the right there is showing off the long and flexible antenna that kind of sits off the back of the birds. Does not interfere with their flight or any other movements through the grasslands. And smiling down upon him is our modus coordinator, Matt Webb. So this is what some of the data looks like. Each tag will emit a unique signature or frequency, so we can determine where they go and how fast they're moving between stations, so we can learn about their migration ecology, how long they might stay in an area, so we can learn about their stopover ecology, and many other aspects about their behavior and conservation needs. And the bubbles indicate the date in which each tag was detected. So for example, those green bubbles are our male Lark Bunting that we tagged. He's in fairly close proximity to our station, and he's doing frequent aerial displays up in the air. So he's been detected almost every day since he was tagged. Conversely, this little blue bubble is our Grasshopper Sparrow that we tagged. And Grasshopper Sparrows tend to spend more time kind of sulking in the tall grass. They actually run along the ground a lot. They don't come up onto higher vegetation very often. They don't have elaborate aerial displays. So his detections have been much less frequent, even though these birds were caught in the same net on the very same day. So this is just an example of the kinds of data that we're already collecting. And then with a network of stations going all the way down into Mexico, we'll be able to see what these birds' movements look like in real time when they leave Soapstone, like we've never been able to see before. So in addition to the vast undisturbed native vegetation, there's some endangered species like this Colorado butterfly plant that's pictured here with the Baird Sparrow pictured on it. It's a bird of concern perched on a plant of concern here in northern Colorado. This area has the keystone species like black-tailed prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, an amazing suite of grassland birds. There's another important and iconic wildlife symbol of the shortgrass prairie that now calls the mountains to plains area home, which is the American bison. And it was introduced to Soapstone in 2015, which really brought all of the pieces of this important and amazing ecosystem together again here in northern Colorado. So I want to leave you with this video about the reintroduction of the bison to Soapstone, and the partnerships involved that really made it a success.
To see such a
Oh, sorry. If I move anything on my other screen, it turns this off.
to see such a tremendous animal, really an American icon and such a well-respected animal to actually have its hooves touch the ground in this area again it's just beautiful.
Culturally, bison are very important to a lot of the Native Americans that were on the Front Range back when bison were still here. And it's a very important component to their cultural history of seeing bison back on this landscape.
The buffalo have not only kept us alive 100+ years, but also clothed us, housed us, gave us tools, gave us medicines.
It's an animal that has survived against a lot of challenges and kind of against all odds, and it really represents, you know, the spirit of the American West, the culture of the Native American people, and just kind of a general resiliency, which I think a lot of people in this country identify with and connect with.
The buffalo mean a lot. Their buffalo culture, and all the tribes of America that one day were buffalo, part of the buffalo culture. And that day will happen again.
Well, this project started at CSU primarily from a curiosity of mine during my postdoc here at the Animal Reproduction Biotechnology Lab. Just having seen them out here in Colorado and kind of on this landscape, and I just started wondering about them and their history and just their conservation status and those types of things. And that kind of drew me into asking those really important questions about how the reproductive science could potentially benefit the species.
Our interest started back after we adopted our management plan for Red Mountain Open Space. One interest was the possibility of bison.
We were going through a management planning process for Soapstone Prairie, and the idea of bringing bison back to that landscape was really generated through that process. We'd always been in close contact with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Animal Plant Health and Inspection Service folks here in Fort Collins, and they always encourage us to really think about Yellowstone bison. The Yellowstone herd is an excellent herd for doing restoration or starting new herds from, because within the Yellowstone herd, there's four of the five foundation herds represented.
The Yellowstone bison are a really special group of animals. And, you know, that's for a variety of reasons. One is that they're genetically diverse, and that's directly related to the history of that herd and how it was created, even after most of the bison were slaughtered. Anytime you have a genetically valuable group of animals, you want to preserve those and make sure they're well represented in the population.
It's very rich with the genetic makeup, very diverse, which is a good population to do restoration from. The only problem is that it is infected with brucellosis.
Brucellosis is a bacterial disease that can infect bison and other animals, including livestock and even people.
What Dr. Barfield's working on, which is to a great extent removing genetics from animals that could be infected with various diseases such as brucellosis, and cleaning up the embryos, the genetics, so that one doesn't move the disease with the genetics.
We don't do any genetic manipulation, so we're not altering the DNA. We're simply preserving the DNA that's out there already. We can fertilize eggs in the lab, or if we have animals that are in our facility, we can do artificial insemination.
Kaylin Figgs with the city and I had met with Jack Ryan because he had learned about what we were interested in. And with his conservation herd at Foothills campus, he had hoped to find a place to be putting them out on the landscape versus in the holding pens there.
The animals that we released to start the Laramie Foothills Bison Conservation Herd, they are brucellosis negative. They have always been brucellosis negative, and they have never tested positive. So the 3 calves that we reintroduced, though, 2 of them came from artificial insemination, and that semen that was used for that artificial insemination was from a bison that had brucellosis. And so we performed a technique where we cleaned up the sperm, and then were able to ensure that we weren't passing on the disease to the mother. And so those animals were actually born here in our facility. We made sure they were healthy, and then we approved them for release, which made them a part of the initial 10 that started the herd.
This is what a crow would say. An owl bad, good chick. Meaning it's a good day. It's a good day.
This animal more or less took care of the people, and the tribes really respect that in that way too. Different tribes have different ways of honoring these bison, whether it's through ceremonial dances or prayers or songs, just out of so much tremendous respect for this animal.
It's a really significant moment for, not just the animals and for our team, but for all of the people who are involved in the project, who take care of that landscape, but also for even the public to see that happen again in that space that's so relevant to the Native American history, and just that you just got the sense of this is where bison should be, this is right. One of the things that we're trying to demonstrate here with our program is that the cleansing of these embryos, it works. It can be used to generate healthy offspring with valuable genetics, and that these animals could be generated like this for other herds and can go other places and hopefully help build new herds or start new herds.
First large mammal in the U.S. that conservation became an issue about was the bison in Yellowstone, actually. It's just nice that we can kind of pick up that story of restoration with some of those Yellowstone genetics and begin to establish some public herds and tribal herds again.
One of the great things about being able to first create these embryos, but then being able to preserve them, so freezing them, they can be frozen for 100 or 1,000 years. And so it's really a way for us to ensure that we're going to have bison on into the indefinite future.
Wow, so that's happening up at Soapstone. Let's see if I can get it. I just wanted to close this saying I've really enjoyed having Soapstone as my outside office for so many years. I feel really lucky as a resident of Fort Collins to live in a city that values open space and conservation. And I encourage anybody, if you ever travel through northern Colorado, to come up and check it out. Shoot me an email. I'd be happy to show you around. And I just want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon and listening to my virtual field trip. And I'd be really happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks so much, Erin, and we really appreciate your time joining us for the conference and providing this virtual experience. These sessions are recorded, and I think this is one that we will post on YouTube. So, and I'll go through and cut out where we had that error in the technology. So I'll pull that out and just post the video. So to get us started, because I know there's a little bit of a lag between what we're seeing in the feed, and so folks need a second to get their questions up. I want to get us started to ask you What's next for Bird Conservancy and Soapstone? You've been doing a lot of monitoring, and there's been a lot of focus here on the natural aspect, but this is also an open space area that people can access. So for folks that might come to Colorado, what can they expect to see, and what's Bird Conservancy going to be doing out there? Those of you viewing, please feel free to add questions, comments in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that.
Yeah, well, there's over 60,000 acres of the open space, but only the 18,000 that is Soapstone is accessible for recreation. So if you come up to visit, you can drive right by the bison herd. You can see them out there. You can ride your bike, your horse, or go running or hiking, bird watching. There's also other wildlife out there, like foxes, swift foxes, really fun to see, rattlesnakes, lots of cool bugs and plants if you're into that. Right now, we are in a like a monitoring schedule with the city, the Natural Areas Department, to monitor Soapstone, do all of those point counts every 3 years. So it's just a continual kind of feedback loop for adaptive management for them, so we can see those population trends and see what they're going to do. And if we see something that concerns us, you know, we give the city our recommendations, like what we saw with the mountain plovers. We see their population tanking, so we need to burn or graze harder, do what we can to keep the prairie dogs around. So that will be ongoing into perpetuity. But our newest project up there being the MODIS project. We built that station, so we'll continue to monitor that station. The rest of this summer, we're done tagging birds because they're not responding to playback anymore. They're done breeding, so they're harder to catch. But now we can go fly a drone with a receiver and kind of test how well a drone can work for monitoring the birds too, in addition to a station. So all of this is really new, and we're the first, at least in this area, to be testing the MODIS technology on grassland birds. So that'll be a 6-year project through the Northern Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. We'll be building stations, I think 9 in Colorado, and then some down into New Mexico and down into northern Mexico. So I'm really excited about that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so two somewhat related questions, I think, about the logistics and structure of Bird Conservancy.
Okay.
Bird makes it sound like you just do bird stuff, but in your presentation, right, there's quite a bit about other species such as bison and black-footed ferret, and you also talked about conservation targets and adaptive management. So could you talk a little bit about the Bird Conservancy's role in overall management of our natural areas here?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't want to confuse, but also wanted to highlight how special Soapstone was. And yeah, we have our science team that does all the research and monitoring, and that is focused on birds, but because birds are an indicator of our healthy habitats. Habitats that we need to survive, habitats that ranchers need for their cattle to thrive, for their bottom end. So we work with private landowners with our stewardship department because most of the grasslands in North America are privately owned. So we have to work with private landowners in order to conserve that habitat and enroll them in its importance and help them with farm bill dollars and other technological assistance that we can give them, using birds as our indicators of that healthy habitat in conservation. So using birds as like an umbrella for our conservation target. If you see this species, that means your grassland is intact. So that's what I mean by conservation targets there, because everything is connected. And they are literally the canary in our coal mine. You know, if we see the plovers disappearing, we're like, what happened? The prairie, it's prairie dogs, you know, it's all connected that way. So yeah, they can help us determine our conservation targets and adaptive management, and then we can watch the birds respond. They respond fairly quickly. So that's why I think birds are a great way to enroll other conservationists.
Wonderful. So you mentioned the fact that grasslands are mostly owned by private landowners. Could you talk a little bit about the role of Bird Conservancy in using citizen science?
Yeah, we do use some citizen science, but mostly for raptor counts, not so much in grasslands. We do have a monitoring program across 14 states called IMBCR, or Integrated Monitoring of Bird Conservation Regions. And those are across all landscapes. So we have partners in BLM, Forest Service, all of the joint ventures like the Playa Lakes joint venture, land managers through the Northern Great Plains. And we hire technicians to do those surveys, sometimes volunteers, you know, as a citizen science project. But most of our work is a protocol, scientifically rigorous point counts. But we do use some citizen science data for things like bald eagle watch we have in Colorado. We have a hawk watch program in Colorado. We monitor screech owls along the Poudre River that flows through Fort Collins. It's Colorado's last wild, historic, scenic river. And so we've got volunteers come in and get their data, the data sheets, and they go out and collect data for us and help us actually monitor those species and see how they're doing. I think the biggest citizen science projects in North America are the breeding bird survey and the Christmas bird count. And those are run through Patuxent, through the ABA, I believe, American Birding Association. Not through us, but we do participate.
Awesome. And just as a heads up for those who are watching this live, I am putting links to some of the things that Erin is mentioning so that you can access the integrated monitoring of Bird Conservancy research, the MODIS tracking system, and I'll try to get those up on the YouTube info box. So if you're watching this later, not live, you'll be able to scroll down and get to these different links. The other thing that I'll mention is that Erin mostly focused on grassland birds and species, but tomorrow we do have another Bird Conservancy event, which is a Birding 101 webinar focused on raptors and waterfowl here in Colorado, and kind of with the context that we are in this migratory flyway. And if you are living in Colorado year-round, you can see what I've heard is over 300 species of birds. Maybe not in the exact same place in Colorado, but that's pretty incredible in terms of a place to be in the world.
Yeah.
I don't see other questions. So what I'll do at this point is encourage folks to follow Bird Conservancy on Twitter. Go ahead and their YouTube channel also has a lot of videos. I've seen some of the webinars that you guys have done be posted up on YouTube. So that's also a good resource to see what Bird Conservancy is doing. And I know it's called Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, but it seems like your actual range is a little bit wider than just the Rocky Mountains. And so definitely check out what the Conservancy is doing in terms of land management and engagement, because it's a very exciting organization. Erin, anything else you want to add there at the end before we finish up?
No, I just want to say thanks and enjoy the rest of your conference. And yeah, feel free to get in touch if you have any other questions.
Awesome. And there are a few sessions on grassland management. So those of you watching, if you want to follow up on that, check out our program. Erin, you're welcome to join any of our sessions throughout this week. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye.
Bye.